Welcome to Book by Book. We are going to be talking about 1 Kings 5 through 8. And so we are in the reign of Solomon, and he is getting things going. And as we are jumping in, everything we're going to look at tonight really does revolve around the building of the temple. And so there will be some things that will feel repetitive and redundant from one of my favorite jokes is this is from the Office of Redundancy and Repetition Department. And so there are times when we read through this passage that it'll be like, I feel like we just read that. And we did. So the part of the important thing to remember with the temple is this is land that was secured by David. These were a lot of the resources that were procured by David. But David was not able to actually build the temple because he was a man of war. Solomon is a man he had no wars. There was violence that he commanded to happen as a part of executing justice in the kingdom. But he is a man who is not known for bloodshed in war, and that kind of sets him apart. And so as he is getting going, there are some things that we're going to note here about the size of the temple. And I'm not really great at keeping all these numbers in my head and remembering how much a cubit is to compare to a foot or a meter or anything like that. But one of the things that I want us to recognize is that Solomon's temple is actually considerably smaller than Herod's temple. So the temple that Jesus went to, that was built by King Herod, hundreds and hundreds of years after this. Solomon's temple was significant, but it was not huge. And the temple that they rebuilt after the exile was less impressive than Solomon's temple. And we'll read about that, in the months to come, where the people who return from the exile will weep because they remembered what Solomon's temple was really like. And so it didn't measure up. And so, so as we're thinking about this, also the temple, good to see you guys. The temple is something that, Solomon built, but it was not, the construction was not actually unique to Israel. Other temples in the ancient world also had a similar layout. And so it is a significant piece for the people of Israel, but it is not like Solomon had this like vision of the temple being dropped down from heaven and he was going to build that. Fun fact though, in America, we, the Mormon church, they were the prophet Joseph Smith and prophet Brigham Young, over all their history, and it gets messy and convoluted. But by the time they got to Salt Lake City, they built Salt Lake City based on a vision that one of the prophets had about how big the blocks should all be and everything oriented around the temple. And so it was, if you've ever been to Salt Lake City, it's weird. It feels weird. And a lot of that is because the blocks are too big. Like they're huge. And it takes a long time to cross the street because the streets are too wide and the blocks are too long. But they built based on the vision that the prophet had. And they said, this is what we're doing. And so this building that Solomon's going to build is not something that the Lord gave him a specific vision for, but it is an echo of the tabernacle. And there are some folks who think that the tabernacle was actually moved into the temple at some point, and so that the transition from tabernacle to temple was really just like now the temple houses the tabernacle. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, but let's just get into this. There's a lot of ground to cover. So chapter 5 of 1 Kings, starting in verse 1. When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David, when he said, your son, whom I will put on the throne in your place, will build the temple for my name. So give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians. When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, praise be to the Lord today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, I have received the message you sent me and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away. And you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household. And so here we have Hiram and Solomon starting their bromance. So these are two guys who are sons of kings, and they are David had a decent relationship with the Sidonians and Tyre. And so now Solomon is saying, hey, I could use your help. And Lebanon, if you've ever seen the flag of Lebanon, it actually has a cedar on it. Like they're like our trees are our thing. Like this is what we do, is trees. And so having a significant supply of trees and long timbers would be important as they are trying to build this temple. And so Solomon even says, like, you guys are the best at cutting down trees. Like we want the best for the temple. And he's even saying there's this important theological piece here as well, is in how Solomon is talking about the temple, because he recognizes, and theologically throughout the Old Testament, the writers want us to understand that God does not actually live in the temple. And so he says it's a temple for the name of the Lord my God. So it is not a place where God will live, because God cannot be contained by a temple. And so the idea of God's name is having a place where his glory rests, or his people can fix their attention to remember him and his covenant based on his name. But there is no idol to Yahweh in the temple. And that is one of the significant changes that is present in the Jerusalem temple compared to ancient world temples. Because in the ancient world temples, they would have these different courts getting to a most holy place, like Solomon's temple. But in that most holy place, there would be an idol representing the deity. In the most holy place in the tabernacle and now in the temple, the ark is going to be in there, but the ark is not representing the Lord. It's really the mercy seat is what they call the area over the Ark of the Covenant, but it's really a place where it's like his footrest. So it's not even supposed to represent God. And so that is a significant difference between the two. And so Hiram agrees to these terms, or to say, we'll send these down. And the way that they're going to actually move the logs is they're going to cut them down and take them down to the sea and then float them, like they would do here. We are in a logging region. And so if you ever go out to Aberdeen and you look over into the, I think it's the Aberdeen River, you can see in the river sometimes like a bunch of logs out there. They would lash them together, make them a raft, and then just kind of float them down the river. And that's an ancient way that worked for a real long time, until they started getting the big trucks that they could expand and terrify you when you're trapped between two on I-5, and you're like, please let those chains not break. So sometimes we see like techniques that are happening in the Old Testament where it's just like, that happened for a long time. There was no greater invention or innovation there. So all right, so let's jump on to verse 10. In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs he wanted. And Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of processed olive oil. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom, just as he had promised him. There was peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon to shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,500 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Byblos cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. So Hiram is supplied food and olive oil in exchange for logs, paying for the lumber to be cut. And so the household is not just Hiram getting all of this stuff, but it's also Hiram is going to use this as a wage to provide for those laborers who are doing the work of cutting down and transporting the trees. Solomon then is sending out these 30,000 Israelite men, and they are conscripted laborers. But there is an important note here, is that these 30,000 men were not considered slaves of Israelites, because the law said you cannot enslave an Israelite. And so Solomon is not enslaving the Israelites, but they are rotating through. And so the people, because the temple is for the people, is part of the way that it's going to be presented to everybody. Like, hey, this is for us. So these men were sent in 1 month shifts to go and work with Hiram and then come back for 2 months. And so they would go back and forth like this. The contrast, though, is there are these 80,000, these 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervise the project. These 80,000 and 33 or 70,000, these could be Canaanites that were conscripted into slave type labor. And so that's something to note. There are little things that we are going to see in Solomon's reign where it's like, this is not good. And this is one of those things that could be not good, that they're starting to enslave others. Slavery is not something that the Lord wants for his people. And even when it comes into a point where somebody falls into debt, in the Old Testament, they're never supposed to be enslaved forever. It was always supposed to be something where, like, if they sold themselves into slavery, there was a promise of freedom after a certain period of time, and they were just to pay down their debt. This is one of those things where it's like, what's happening here? Are we seeing Solomon being more like Egypt? And the more and more people are like Egypt, the worse and worse things are going to be for Israel. So that's a little red flag that we should just be like, wait a second, not great. So, and this project here is going to go on for several years. And part of what they're doing here as well, they're noting that they're cutting the quarry blocks, and they're cutting blocks in the quarry, and then they will do most of the dressing and massive, like, loud work away from the temple area. And they'll get into that a little bit later. But part of this is because they recognize that this space is supposed to be holy. And so even before the temple is built, they don't want to create an ungodly ruckus. And so they are doing a lot of work offsite and then bringing it back like a puzzle to put it all together. So verse 6:1. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So this is a significant dating. 480 years is 40 times 12. And so this number is one of those numbers that, sometimes we read the Bible and you're like, is this an accurate number or is this an idealized number? And this is one of those where it's like 40 is a significant number for the Bible. 12 is a significant number for the Bible because of the tribes of Israel. And so is the writer just saying like at just the right time that this is when they built. And so dating in the Old Testament can be difficult because sometimes they're not as precise as we would want them to be based on our standards. They're as precise as they need to be for their standards. So that's just something to note. But contrast the previous paragraph where Solomon is starting to get people involved in the labor that maybe did not want to be involved in the labor, slaves. And then the next paragraph, we have this 480 years after they left Egypt, there is a little bit of Egyptness coming into Israel. So that's something to just kind of keep in mind. Verse 2, the temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. And that is about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, if you can visualize that. So it's not huge. It's big, but it's not huge. The portico at the front of the main hall of the temple extended the width of the temple, that is 20 cubits, and projected 10 cubits from the front of the temple. He made the narrow windows high up in the temple walls. Against the walls of the main hall and inner sanctuary, he built a structure around the building in which there were side rooms. The lowest floors were 5 cubits wide, the middle floors were 6 cubits, and the third floor 7 cubits. He made offset ledges around the outside of the temple so that nothing would be inserted into the temple walls. And so as he's building the temple structure, there's also the walls around the temple, and in the temple walls there are like storage rooms. But one of the interesting ways of the rooms are being built is they have like 5 cubits, and then 6 cubits, and then 7 cubits. And so they're from smaller to on the bottom to larger on top. So it's kind of got a stair step in the wall that is happening as well. And so it's not just like they're hanging over like 6 cubits and then 7 cubits like a cantilever, but they are part of the wall that is thicker on the bottom, and it could be to kind of defend it a little bit more, the temple space. So so that's part of what's happening here is he's building these storage rooms. Verse 7, in building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. And so they were doing all that loud work somewhere else, bringing it in, putting it together like an IKEA furniture piece. The entrance to the lowest floor was on the south side of the temple. A stairway led up to the middle level, and from there to the third. So he built the temple and completed it, roofing it with beams and cedar planks. And he built the side rooms all along the temple. The height of each was 5 cubits, and they were attached to the temple by beams of cedar. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. So as he's building this, he hears this word from the Lord saying, follow my ways. Now, previously, David told Solomon the same thing. Follow the ways of God. And now Solomon, last week we looked at Solomon asking the Lord, like, I want wisdom to lead your people. And God said, I will give you that. I will give you long life. I will give you victory. I will give you riches, all of these things, because you're my chosen one here. You're the one that I want to lead Israel. And so here's another reinforcement for Solomon. Just follow my ways and it will be good for you. So we'll see how that goes. Verse 14. So Solomon built the temple and completed it. He lined its interior walls with cedar boards, paneling them from the floor of the temple to the ceiling, and covered the floor of the temple with planks of juniper. And so if you have wood paneling at home, it's not ugly. It's like the temple. So he partitioned off 20 cubits of the rear of the temple with cedar boards from floor to ceiling, and from within the temple and an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. The main hall in front of this room was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar carved with gourds and open flowers. Everything was cedar, no stone was to be seen. So all the walls are these big, huge stones that are dressed on the outside and decorated, but inside is all paneling, essentially of cedar, with all of these different gourds and flowers inside. One of the things to note is the way that the temple is decorated inside is full of fruit and flowers and these gourds. It's a garden. And so that is something that, like, when you read through the scriptures, we are, humanity is created and placed in the garden. And in the future, like, we are going to be in the city of God. But all throughout the way of scripture, we're trying to get back to the garden. We really do want to have that place where we're in relationship with God again. And so all of the ornamentation in the temple is trying to help the people remember the garden, to get back to that place. Where am I? Yeah, so he's building the different rooms. So the portico, the holy place, and then the most holy place. And in verse 19, he prepared the inner sanctuary within the temple to set the ark of the covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. Solomon covered the inside of the temple with pure gold, and he extended gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, which was overlaid with gold. So he overlaid the whole interior with gold. He also overlaid with gold the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary. So everything is very, very expensive. With the temple, and this was the same with the building of the tabernacle, from the farthest out and the way in, materials became more valuable, more precious, all the way to the Ark of the Covenant, which was already overlaid with gold. And so the tabernacle has that scheme happening where it's like less expensive, very expensive. And the temple is doing the same thing. So by the time you get into the most holy place, it's gold, it's ornate, it's amazing in that most holy place. It's the most expensive place in the whole temple as well. And because gold is a precious metal, and it is something that people around the world have valued forever, is gold. So verse 23, for the inner sanctuary, he made a pair of cherubim out of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the first cherub was 5 cubits long, and the other wing 5 cubits, 10 cubits from wingtip to wingtip. The second cherub also measured 10 cubits for the two cherubim were identical in size and shape. The height of each cherub was 10 cubits. He placed the cherubim inside the innermost room of the temple with their wings spread out. The wing of the cherub touched one wall, while the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other. So in the middle of the room, he overlaid the cherubim with gold. And so these cherubim, when people talk about angels, they say things like, cherubs, and there's different images that people have of cherubs. The closest actual image of a cherub is much more like the Sphinx in Egypt than like a baby in a diaper, which often people are like, oh, so that baby, he's like a little cherub. It's like, you should not accept that as a compliment. Like, your baby's like a little monster, like the body of a lion and wings and a face of a man. Like, that's not normal. You don't want your baby to look like that. And so, like, these are majestic, powerful looking beings that are in the most holy place, over the ark. And so the ark already had two cherubim with their wings touching already on the mercy seat. And so now Solomon is magnifying that, making it even more substantial, because this is now, instead of a tent that's being moved around with the people of Israel, this is a permanent structure. And so everything that he's doing is kind of bigger and grander. But he is still going to have the ark there in the most holy place. And all of these things are overlaid with gold, because he can. Verse 29, on the walls all around the temple, in both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. So again, more garden imagery with these trees and flowers. He also covered the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. For the entrance and the inner sanctuary, he made doors out of olive wood that were 1/5 of the width of the sanctuary. And on the 2 olive wood doors, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid the cherubim and palm trees with hammered gold. In the same way, for the entrance to the main hall, he made door frames out of olive wood, and they that were 1/4 of the width of the hall. He also made 2 doors out of juniper wood, each having 2 leaves that turned in sockets. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and overlaid them with gold, hammered evenly over the carvings. And he built the inner courtyard of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams. The foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all of its details according to the specifications. He had spent 7 years building it. 7 years building the temple. That seems like a significant amount of time. And the timing, so we have this, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, and then 7 years of completion, the temple is built. And these dates that we have here, we are told is the month of Bul. And that is that's not the Hebrew word for the month. It's actually a Canaanite word for the month, which is strange. But it is tied to the Feast of Tabernacles. And so the Tabernacles feast is in the fall, and it is a remembrance for the people for when they were wandering in the wilderness for those 40 years, and the Lord provided for them. And so it is one of the pilgrimage holidays where the people of Israel were supposed to come to Jerusalem and sleep outside. And so they would camp in the outside regions. They would build these tabernacles. If they had a structure in the house, in the city walls, they would build a tent, tabernacle, booth on their roof, and they would sleep outside. And it was supposed to be so that they could look up and see the stars. So it wasn't like a perfect shelter, like, here you build a tabernacle like they were building during this festival, and you'd be rained on, like, because that's just how we are here. But it was supposed to be open and exposed to help them remember the times that they were wandering and looked at the stars every night. And so the completion of the temple coinciding with the Festival of Tabernacles is something that is providential, which is say like, oh, hey, we're done. Y'all come down here. And so they were supposed to come anyway to be a part of this festival. And so now the temple's there, and they will celebrate that in a moment. But before that, we looked at 7 years to build the temple. 7 years is a long time. And in any building project, 7 years, it would be exhausting. However, in verse 7:1, it took Solomon 13 years to complete the construction of his palace. So which was a higher priority for Solomon? 7 years for a temple, 13 years for a palace. It's interesting. It's an interesting contrast. And was he doing these at the same time? Did he start the palace after finishing it? Like, we don't know exactly the timing of it all, but we do see that he put a lot of time and energy into his temple. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. And one of the theories behind the name, the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon, is because it is believed to have had these pillars out of these cedar trees from Lebanon, and that there were so many, it looked like a forest, is what they're saying. doesn't necessarily mean he built a palace in Lebanon. With 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams, it was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3, facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front part in sets of 3s facing each other. He made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico, and in front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, that's not where the Justice League hangs out, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace in which he was to live, set farther back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Red flag, red flag, red flag. Pharaoh's daughter is getting her own palace, really close to his palace, really close to the temple. All kinds of things are like, oh, this is not great. Verse 9, all these structures from the outside to the great courtyard and from foundation to eaves were made of blocks of high-grade stone cut to size and smoothed on their inner and outer faces. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. Above were high-grade stones cut to size and cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico. So pretty impressive palace. It's also the city hall, essentially, because this is the civic center. So his palace would be connected to the Hall of Justice, where he would actually do king work. But all of this is very ornate, very expensive. And it would have been really something to see this palace that Solomon built. Now, David already had a palace. And so why Solomon felt like he needed to build his own, we're not told. But he's a king. Kings do things that we don't always get to understand. Verse 13. King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was from Tyre, and a skilled craftsman in bronze. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. Now, this is a different person than Hiram. This is Huram, and he is an Israelite who lives, or half Israelite who lives in Tyre. But what we're told here is that he has all this wisdom and understanding. Now, when we go all the way back again to Exodus, when Moses gets the directions for building the tabernacle, we are introduced to Bezalel and Oholiab. We are told about them that the Lord has anointed them and gifted them with the skills of crafts and arts to make all the things that were supposed to be a part of the tabernacle. And so when we talk about spiritual gifts, and when I was in college, I went to a class called Church in Ministry, and we took spiritual gifts assessments, and they were looking only at the spiritual gifts that were listed in Paul's letters and in 1 Peter. And we did these assessments, and they said, you have the gift of leadership, you have the gift of helps. You know what was not on any of those spiritual gifts lists? Art, craftsmanship. That wasn't considered a spiritual gift. But the Bible clearly tells us that the Lord enables people to do the craft, to do the work. And so when we look at spiritual gifts lists in the Bible, we should recognize that these are not comprehensive in any of the New Testament letters. And there are gifts that are listed in the Old Testament that are not listed in the New Testament, and gifts in the New Testament that are not listed in the Old Testament. And we should recognize that maybe even now, the Holy Spirit is able to gift people for the time that we're in with specific things. So can the Lord use his power to gift people to be good at code? Could code for computers be a spiritual gift? Right? There's no reason it couldn't, except that we tend to think too small. And so when somebody says their work if somebody feels like they don't have a calling on their life, this is one of the saddest things that I've ever encountered is one of my friends was not called to be a pastor, he told me I don't have a calling on my life. I was like, no, you do have a calling. You have all these skills. And he did leather repair for upholstery. And like, he was really good at it. It's like, you have a skill here. You have a gift, and you can use that for God's purposes. And so it's okay to open up our understanding of like, what is a spiritual gifts? What is a gift that God might give to people? As long as it's not like actively causing sin in your life or somebody else's life, this could be the Spirit working in you and enabling you to do awesome things. So it's a little soapbox. Now step down off that soapbox. So Huram is going to get to work making things. He cast 2 bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. He made two capitals of cast bronze to set on top of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high. A network of interwoven chains adorned the capitals on top of the pillars, 7 for each capital. He made pomegranates in 2 rows, encircling each network to decorate the capitals on the top of the pillars. He did the same for each capital. And so the top of the pillars in the temple, the very top of them have all of these pomegranates on them. And pomegranates are interesting because there is tradition that pomegranates, have you ever opened a pomegranate? They're full of seeds, right? And there is a tradition that the pomegranate has 613 seeds, which also coincides to how many laws are in the Torah. And so like those kinds of like traditions like carry over. And so having all of these pomegranates all over the temple, that's one of those things where people are like, all of these are representing to us the value and the power of the law and its completion. So whether or not it actually has 613 seeds, I've never taken the time to count. But they're all over the place with all of these, the tops of these pillars. On the capitals of both pillars above the bowl-shaped part next to the network were the 200 pomegranates in rows all around. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillars to the south he named Jachin, and the one to the north he named Boaz. The capitals on top were in the shapes of lilies, and so the work on the pillars was completed. And so even here we have more flower and fruit imagery happening in the construction. And so again, we should be thinking back to the garden. We're getting back to the garden. And the names of these items of these pillars is important because one is named the Jachin or Yakin, does not appear prominently in scripture, but it means he establishes. And Boaz means by him he is mighty, is also David's grandfather. And so this pillar may be a tie back to the Davidic dynasty and the legacy of faithfulness, but then next to Yakin to say he establishes, he is mighty, but tied to David's family as well. So so that's something that, you know, if we're just reading through in English, we might miss what do these names mean, but they're significant. So then verse 23, he made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure it around. Below the rim, gourds encircled it, 10 to a cubit. The gourds were cast in 2 rows in one piece with the sea. The sea stood on 12 bulls, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea rested on top of them, and their hindquarters were toward the center. It was a handbreadth in breadth and thickness, and its rim was like the rim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It held 2,000 baths, and 2,000 baths is 12,000 gallons of water. I mean, this thing is huge, and it's huge and it's elevated, and so it's filling it up with water is a significant project. The bath was there, and we'll see it. It's really there to be part of the ceremonial washing for the priests, but it's placed in a way that it's actually inconvenient to do that. And so whether or not it was ever used is one question. for the actual washing, or if it was just like there to say like, this is here to symbolize the washing. But it's so big. I mean, they call it the sea because it's just so big. And verse 27, he also made 10 movable stands of bronze. Each was 4 cubits long, 4 wide, and 3 high. Oh, before I go beyond that, the bulls underneath are believed to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And so when the tabernacle was constructed in the wilderness and the tribes were arranged around it, there were 3 on each side in their arrangement. And so that's part of what is most likely happening with these 12 bulls. Part of the challenge and the danger here is there's now becoming more and more imagery being brought into the temple, and the temptation that is going to happen for the people of Israel is having all these images is, should we be worshiping these images? That's what the people in the other nations do. They worship all these idols. And so in the construction here, we are not told that they are ever given any instruction to worship any of these symbols, but the temptation will be there. So keep that in mind. Verse 27, he also made 10 movable stands of bronze. Each was 4 cubits long, 4 wide, and 3 high. This is how the stands were made. They had side panels attached to uprights. On the panels between the uprights were lions, bulls, and cherubim, and on the upright as well. Above and below the lions and bulls were wreaths of hammered work. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles, and each had a basin resting on 4 supports cast with wreaths on each side. On the inside of the stand, there was an opening that had a circular frame 1 cubit deep. This opening was round, and with the basework, it measured 1.5 cubits. Around its opening, there was engraving. The panels of the stands were square, not round. The 4 wheels were under the panels, and the axles of the wheels were attached to the stand. The diameter of each wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like chariot wheels. The axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were of cast metal. Each stand had 4 handles, 1 on each corner projecting from the stand. At the top of the stand, there was a circular band 0.5 cubit deep. The supports and panels were attached to the top of the stand. He engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees on the surfaces of the supports and on the panels on every available space with wreaths all around. This is the way he made 10 stands. They were all cast in the same molds and were identical in size and shape. Then he made 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across, 1 basin, to go on each of the 10 stands. He placed 5 of the stands on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north. He placed the sea on the south side at the southeast corner of the temple. He also made the pots and shovels and sprinkling bowls. So Hiram finished the work he had undertaken for King Solomon in the temple of the Lord. That work included 2 pillars, 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 2 sets of network decorating the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of network, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network decorating the bowls-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 10 stands with their 10 basins, the sea, and the 12 bowls under it, the pots, shovels, and sprinkling bowls. So this is really basically just reading the receipt from the work order. So all these objects that Hiram made for King Solomon of the temple of the Lord were burnished bronze. The king had them cast in clay molds in the plain of the Jordan between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon left all these things unweighed because they were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. So like bronze is not cheap, but there's so many that Solomon's just like, I don't even want to bother. Like, just do what you got to do. Don't tell me how much it weighs. Don't tell me how much it costs. It's going to be what it's going to be. Solomon also made all the furnishings that were in the Lord's temple. And when it says Solomon made, it should read Solomon had made these things made. He wasn't the one doing all the work. The golden altar, the golden table on which all the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right and 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary, the gold floral work and lamps and tongs, the pure gold basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes, and censers, and the gold sockets for the doors of the innermost room, the most holy place, and also for the doors of the main hall of the temple. When all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple. So those treasuries of the Lord's temple, those are probably in those storage rooms that he built along the side. And so the resources and the furnishings that were used regularly in the temple were, out and in use, but there were also backup things, and there was resources that David acquired that he didn't use. And so he has all that stored in the temple. So, oh my word, there's so much. I don't think we're going to finish through 8 today, but we'll get through. Let's get through 21. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival of the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. And so here we are. It is time to dedicate the temple. It is lined up with the Feast of Tabernacles. So he's calling people in, and it's specifically the elders of the tribes, but the other people will come as well. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meetings and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and the Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. This is not unlike David when he moved the temple from or the tabernacle from Obed-Edom's house or property to Jerusalem. He stopped all along the way, making sacrifices every 7 steps. So this is similar, like they're making a lot of sacrifices as they're heading into Jerusalem, or into the temple complex. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. That word there, overshadowed, is significant because it's also the same word that is the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters in creation. That's the same idea as well. When we jump to Luke chapter 2, the Holy Spirit will overshadow you. So the Spirit is doing something in that overshadowing, there's like these echoes. Like the reason that the shadow is here is to remind the people that the Spirit of God is working. So overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. The poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place. And so Solomon had made new poles for the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant. And so it went into the most holy place, and the poles were coming out of the curtain somehow. So people could look into the temple, and there's these doors, and they could look into from the courtyard into the holy place, and then into the most holy place. But there's this curtain blocking it, and so they could just see 2 poles coming out. So the people would know the tabernacle is the Ark of the Covenant is there. So it's just an interesting little note that Solomon built longer poles for some reason. And they are still there today. So this note here is something that is important for us to recognize. They are still there today. The book of First Kings, this part in particular, was written before the exile, before Jeremiah, because Jeremiah talks about the temple being destroyed and the artifacts in the temple being carted off into Babylon and many things being destroyed along the way. And so the fact that this is just a little sign to us, like when this was written was before the exile. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord had made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. And that is something that we should also take note of, because when they came out of Egypt, or when they came into the promised land, the ark contained the 2 tablets, which are the covenant between Israel and the Lord. It's not like the 10 commandments and 5 on one side and 5 on the other. It's like the covenant is written on these tablets. And the jar of manna that they collected, and Aaron's rod that had budded to show like he's the Lord's chosen priest, right? Those were all in the ark at one point, and now they're gone. And so why are they gone? Most folks seem to think that maybe the Philistines opened it up and took stuff out. And so that by the time they got it back, those artifacts were gone. So when you think about opening the Ark of the Covenant, like when the Israelites touch it in 2 Samuel, when what's his name? The guy reaches out and touches it, he dies. That's a covenant agreement between the Lord and his people. They should know better. The Philistines, they don't have a covenant with the Lord. And so when they open it, it's not something where the Lord's going to judge them. They don't know better. And so that's, like when we think of like the Ark, most of us are probably thinking Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you open it and like God lasers come out and Nazis' faces melt. That's probably not what we should think about when we think about the Ark of the Covenant. So just FYI, if your understanding of the Ark is only based on Steven Spielberg and that movie, we've got a lot of work to do, and that's fine. I'm happy to do the work. Verse 10, when the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because the cloud for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. So anytime the Lord moved into the tabernacle, again, in the law books, a cloud filled the tabernacle and the priests couldn't do the work. And so here we see this again as they're beginning the work. The cloud fills the temple. Verse 12, then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. He said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his own hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to my father David. For he said, since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built so that my name might be there. But I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, you did well to have it in your heart to build a temple for my name. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, your own flesh and blood. He is the one who will build the temple for my name. The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David, my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel, just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I have provided a place there for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our ancestors when he brought them out of Egypt. We'll stop there because Solomon has done this thing. He's affirming the history of God's redemption for the people. And he's pleased. Solomon's pleased. Look, it all happened. It all worked. And then he is, recognizing that God's glory is present there. So we'll pick up next week with verse 22. I want to give us some time because we're going to hear the Solomon praying and talking about some future things that will be a part of Israel's life. So this is as good a place as any to stop tonight. So the rest of chapter 8 is really long. So any questions or observations or thoughts from this week's section? Michael. Why is the cherubim not considered an idol? The main reason is because they're not instructed to worship it. So the cherubim were already on the Ark of the Covenant on the seat. And so Solomon is just magnifying what's already there. But it is never supposed to be something that they're never supposed to bow down and worship the Ark. And that's one of the challenges that they, even when they bring it out to war against the Philistines, they're thinking of it like a totem of sorts for them. But that's not how God thinks about the Ark. It's not It's not for him in any way to be an object of worship or something to try to manipulate God to do something for you. And so the cherubim that Solomon constructed, again, Solomon's building this thing not from God's vision, but from his own, like, this is what I'm going to do. But the Lord still blesses it, mainly because they're never told to worship the cherubim on the ark. So this is part of the whole process. Does that make sense? It is confusing when you think about, like, don't have any graven images, don't have any idols. And here we have some statues in the temple already as Solomon is building it. It is not supposed to be an idol. Whether or not people held up to that, TBD. People of Israel, as we read through the book of Kings, they're going to have a lot of struggles with idols all throughout. And so it's not supposed to be an idol, just because they're not supposed to worship it. So, yeah. But when we think of that command to not make any graven images, it doesn't mean we can't have any art. It doesn't mean that there can't be, depictions of things. And so that's part of the tension point. When we read the law, like, we can go like to the letter of the law to say, okay, then no art, no images, nothing. Or we can recognize, like, no, you're not supposed to have any graven images as idols. And that's the command. So does that help? I mean, I kind of felt like I was kind of walking around, but yeah, it's not an idol because they weren't supposed to worship it, is the main thing. So same with the bulls. They were never supposed to worship the bulls. But, I already talked about the Salt Lake City. And if you've ever been to one of the Mormon temples, they have a baptistry in the temple, and you can go and tour it as a non-Mormon. My son and I, we went there for his 10-year birthday trip thing, and our hotel was across the street from the temple. I didn't know this. I was very confused on Sunday morning when we're eating breakfast, and there's all these people in suits coming off tour buses. They're going to the temple. But you could go in and you could tour around, and they show you what's happening. They have a sea, basically, not as big as Solomon's, but it's the baptistry, and underneath their baptistry, they have 12 bulls. And so they're incorporating some of this imagery, but it's getting all confused with their baptism practices. Bless you. I heard a sneeze over here. So yeah, but we should be careful. Anytime there are temptations for idolatry in our culture even now. And so while we don't have a statue in the big room, I get nervous. This is me personally. I get nervous when I see an American flag right next to a cross, because that's communicating something here, that these two things may have similar value to us. And I love our country, but America is not the savior of the world. That's Jesus. And so equating those two things, that's where we get in trouble. And we have to watch out for those kinds of idolatries. And we're going to talk about idolatry on Sunday, I think. Yeah, we will. We'll talk about idolatry every Sunday. I'll promise you that. But we, the human heart, we're just really good at making idols. And so we have to watch out for that. And so even Solomon, in building the temple, like in these last words, is like, look what I have done. Mm-hmm. Watch out. As soon as we start saying, look what I have done, we need to slow our roll, slow down. It's God's faithfulness to David, not Solomon's genius, that has actually made these things happen. And we'll see that with future kings. The only reason Israel survived is because God is faithful to David. So, yeah. Any other thoughts, questions online? Kevin.
Yeah, I was curious about, the temple is for the name of the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
but yet in 12 in chapter 8, he talked about how this is a place for you to dwell forever. He talked about how it's not a place to encompass God. So why does Solomon
Yeah,
Back to that thing, you're gonna dwell forever there, where other part just says the name of the Lord.
right. Yeah. So the question I'm repeating for the people online.
Yeah.
So I'm trying, Jane. Jane emailed me, hey, repeat the questions. Why does do we say this is a place for the name of the Lord, but also why does Solomon say you will dwell here?
Yeah.
And so there is a tension in this because God can't be limited to a temple, right? And so it's not that he lives there, like Dagon lived in the temple for the Philistines, right? They believed that's where he hung out. And so they would bring him out. They would bring their idols out to go to war because they needed the God with them, right? The Hebrew people, they did not have that idea of the Lord living in one place because he's the creator of all of the universe. And even Solomon will say, like, no temple can really contain you. But when he says he chooses to dwell here, it's a place where his name dwells. And so like the cloud coming in and filling is like your glory is choosing to be here. You are signifying that you are wanting to be with us, but even this is not enough for you, is part of what we'll get to in the next prayer section. But yeah, so God is, his dwelling is a symbolic dwelling more than an actual, like, I live here now. But it's important later. Oh man, Ezekiel's going to really mess us all up. But it's important later because Ezekiel will have a vision of the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. And it's this cloud glory leaving. And even when we look at like Job and his encounter with the Lord, he will talk, like his encounter with God is really like God in the hurricane and this powerful like force in the cloud coming and talking to him. And so there's this cloud imagery of God's presence among his people, but that is not to say like that's all he is. So yeah, it's a odd tension, like to say, like, because we have a hard time conceiving of the infinite. And so when the infinite Lord is choosing to humble himself in this way, it's like, but is he dwelling here? Is he here? Is he not here? Is he everywhere? What is it? Yeah, he's everywhere. So, but yeah, the glory of his name to dwell there, that is an important idea. It's like his name alone is glorious. Like, what should I call? What should I tell them? Your name is, Moses says, I am that I am. And you could translate it. You can tell them my name is, I exist, deal with it. Right? It's just like, I don't need a name like Set or Dagon. I don't need that. I am. That's all you need. So, yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? All right. Well, y'all, this is not the most exciting stuff in the Bible, but it is one of the most significant things for the people of Israel. And so the temple is a massive shift from being nomads. Remember, Abraham was a man who left his father's household to a land that God would promise. They were nomads, they were slaves, they were nomads again, and then they were conquerors, and then they were trying to figure it out, and they were all disunified and in different tribes, and then they wanted a king like other nations. And now here they are. They have a kingdom, they have a palace, they have a city capital, they have a wall, they have a temple. They really are rooted into the land that God had promised to give to Abraham. It's taken a long time. And so when we think about the promises of God, we shouldn't try to hurry him up. He's going to take the time he's going to take. But here they are, established in the land. So let's wrap here, and then we will, we'll come back Sunday. We'll talk about Jesus on Sunday, and we'll We'll come back next Wednesday, talk more about the temple. So let me pray for us. Lord, we thank you for your glory. And while the temple had this physical representation of your glory dwelling among the people, Lord, we know that your glory dwells in each of us as your spirit fills us. And so we pray that you would help us to be living temples everywhere we go, and that we would live in light of your love and your grace and your mission. Amen. Amen. All right, y'all, have a good night. We'll talk to you later.